Greetings, people of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. Back again with some more historical insights into historic events. And I know that's redundant, but once again, my podcast. I say what I get to say. So, that's right, I said it. Anyway, for those of you who might be living under a rock for the past few years and just now getting out, or perhaps you forgot to vote, a few days ago it was Election Day. Once again, the American people have spoken, and we have elected a new president. Those of you who don't know, that man is Donald Trump. Some people are happy about it, some people are sad, but anyway, this got me wondering about the history of elections in this country in the first place. Why do we have them? How did it all begin? Well, stick around because that is what I am about to tell you. Now, before we can get to the U.S. elections, we must first discuss government in the early United States. That is to say, briefly during the Revolutionary War and briefly after the Revolutionary. Before the Revolutionary War, for those of you who didn't pay attention in history class or are actually using this podcast as a form of history class, the colonies were under British rule and they were governed, quote unquote, by governors who were appointed by the King of England at the time, King George III. This led to much friction between England and the U.S., as King George was taxing many people unfairly and was a very cruel ruler to those who lived in the colonies. So once America had cut its ties with the deadbeat dad of the world, England, many people were wondering how this new country should be governed. Some early steps were taken in this direction during the 1780s when the Federalist Papers were written in support of the proposed U.S. Constitution and the strong federal government it advocated. And so in October 1787, the first in a series of 85 essays arguing for the ratification of the Constitution appeared in the Independent Journal under the pseudonym Publius. After this, a rather weak document was written called the Articles of the Confederation, which granted Congress the power to conduct foreign policy, maintain armed forces, and coin money. However, this was rather weak and did not give much power to national government, and the government at the time was left mostly to the new states. When the question for national governments came about, again, people were divided. Some people, like George Washington, found that a civilian rule was. Others, however, like Alexander Hamilton, believed that the United States should be a monarchy. Those who were against the monarch idea cited how this country had we had fought off a country that was ruled by a king, and therefore we should not have a monarchy. Those who were in favor of the monarchy, advocating for a powerful, potentially life-term president with extensive authority, which could be seen as a type of elective monarch, which was brought forth during the Constitutional Convention debates in 1787. And some believed a monarch could provide stability and unity in a new nation, acting as a figurehead above political parties. And so, to form a new document that would outline the basics of the government, many of the founding fathers in September of 1787 decided to form a convention. And this would form a new document that would outline the basics of the United States government, which was called the Constitution, and the convention was called the Constitutional Convention. Appropriate. And among the matters discussed at that convention was how the president and vice president should be elected. This was a matter of much debate. Some people thought the vote should be up to the people. Others thought that the vote should be left to the Senate and not to the general public. As a result, the two parties compromised and formed what is now called the Electoral College. And under the plan, the president and vice president would be elected by an electoral college. Each state would have a number of electors equivalent to its combined number of senators and representatives. Each state would also have a minimum of 3 electors. The smallest states had 1 representative and 2 senators, and large states would have far more than 3. Those electors would be chosen in a manner such as each state's legislature may direct. Each elector would cast 2 votes, which for separate candidates, only one of whom would be from the elector's home state. And whichever candidate got the most electoral votes would become President of the United States, assuming the candidate won votes from a majority of electors. And the second place candidate would become Vice President. If no candidate won votes from a majority of electors, then the Senate would choose the President from one of the top 5 vote getters. Before this was settled, the convention considered many plans for how to choose the President and found all of them lacking for a multitude of reasons. They seemed to be settling for the Electoral College as the least objectionable option, and the people's vote would be called the popular vote. However, the biggest problem with the Electoral College at the time was most delegates feared that no one would win a majority in most presidential elections, and the Senate would then regularly choose the president, who might then be controlled by what many thought was the more corruptible House of Congress. A representative from Massachusetts proposed this: if a president was running for re-election and did not win votes from the majority of the electors, then the whole Congress, not just the Senate, would choose the president in that specific scenario. This would make the president less dependent on the Senate, since there would be far more members of the House of Representatives in the Senate. And of course, this led to the first ever elected president, George Washington, or as his boys called him, G-Dubs, or as I like to call him, Washdog George Alicious. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. I got to appeal to the younger crowd. And many other elements of the Electoral College were decided there as well. The convention plan had several votes to pick through different elements of the Electoral College plan, as well as revisiting the presidential term of 4 years. Most significantly, by the 8-3 margin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina opposed. The convention voted to require a presidential candidate to win votes from a majority of electors in order to keep the Senate from deciding. To give you an idea of how big a deal this was at the time, during this time, no other country in the world directly elected its chief executive, so the delegates were wading into uncharted territory, to say the least. Complicating the task was a deep-rooted distrust of executive power. After all, the nation had just fought its way out of a rule by a tyrannical English leader. And so, as you can see, the Electoral College was born out of a compromise. And with that, people needed someone to run for the presidency. And the people had spoken to a general who was recently retired. His name, George Washington, a well-respected man who had thankfully gotten us out of British rule. And interestingly, Washington himself was somewhat reluctant to even run for the presidency. 4 months before the election, in August 1887, he wrote to Alexander Hamilton, "It is my great and sole desire to live and die in peace and retirement on my own farm." And again, 2 months later, to Hamilton, he wrote that he wished the electors would choose someone else, and wrote, "I call heaven to witness that this very act, accepting the presidency, that is, would be the great sacrifice of my personal feelings and wishes, and that ever I have been called upon to make." He even went so far to note that if he became president, he thought it would be enveloped on every side with clouds and darkness. But the people were behind him. Many wrote Washington persuading him to accept the job, and he had found a profound sense of duty. He accepted, though he was doubting himself about being up to the task. He wrote that he felt not unlike a culprit who is going to the place of his execution, quit a powerful body for an ocean of difficulties without the competency of political skill, abilities, and inclination necessary to manage the helm. Integrity of firmness is all I can promise. The people had spoken, and they wanted the man who had spoken, and they wanted the man who had gotten them through the Revolutionary War in the presidency. And so he became the first president, and the first president to be elected using the Electoral College system. In regards to those of you who are interested in the Electoral College, here are some more things that I think you should know. There are over the past 200 years, well more than 700 proposals have been introduced in Congress to reform or entirely eliminate the Electoral College. There have been more proposals for constitutional amendments on changing the Electoral College than any other subject. And also, the American Bar Association has criticized the Electoral College as archaic and, well, ambiguous. And its polling shows that 69% of lawyers favored abolishing it in 1987. But surveys of political scientists have supported the continuation of the Electoral College. Public opinion polls have shown Americans favored abolishing it by majorities of 58% in 1967, 81% in 1968, and 75% in 1981. And if any of the listeners out there are people who side with the abolishing the Electoral College opinion, let me explain why it's still in use. The party in power typically benefits from the existence of the Electoral College, and the minority party has little chance of changing the system because a constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 supermajority in Congress plus the ratification by 3/4 of the states. And let me explain why the Electoral College has also been in favor many times. During the 1960 election, John F. Kennedy's popular vote margin over Richard Nixon was just over 100 18,574. If all 68,838,219 popular votes had just poured into a single national bucket, there would have been powerful incentives to challenge the results in many of the nation's 170,000 precincts, according to columnist George Will. And to anyone wondering if the instances where a president lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote, here you are. First time it happened was in 1824 with John Quincy Adams. The next time it happened was with Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. That followed with Benjamin Harrison in 1888, George W. Bush in 2000, and most recently Donald Trump in 2016. And so now I hope I've shedded some light onto why we still use the Electoral College system. And so with that, I now leave you. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.